This is my review and thoughts on the Butler keynote presentation. So I just wanted to start out with what I thought the important points were. One of them being how inexperienced he was as a child trying to interpret for his father, particularly with the Wells Fargo scenario. He had to interpret all these technical terms, and I could really relate to that because growing up, I had to do the same thing for my mom. If there was meetings where we didn't have an interpreter for some sort of school event, and they probably should have had one, but they didn't, and so I was expected to try to explain what was going on. And as a child, I didn't have any formal teaching as to what even the proper rules of ASL were, let alone how to interpret. And so what I ended up doing most of the time was listening, and then my mom would say, hey, what are they talking about? And I would try to summarize it for her rather than interpret and empower her to understand for herself. And I think that's kind of the same concept that Wing was getting at. I think he probably was more immersed in the deaf community than I was as a child because he had two deaf parents, whereas I only have one. But so I thought that was a really important and relatable point for me. The second thing that I find very important in the video was how I was very surprised at how unprofessional interpreting used to be. Any interpreter any person that knew sign language could say, hey, well, they would go up to a member of the board and say, hey, will you vouch for me? I can sign. And they would just type up this letter and, kind of exaggerate, smudge out the details, and send that to the deaf community to evaluate and say, hey, is this a good interpreter? And it wasn't a very good representation of their actual value and skill set. Therefore, that resulted in a lot of incompetent interpreters, and for the deaf community, I'm sure that created a huge culture of distrust between the deaf and the hearing world. I think it's no wonder that they have such a hard time trusting us. There's such a culture of distrust due to unqualified people stepping into this position of power. These people are primarily responsible for the access of communication for these deaf people. And it's our fault that happened because we weren't very well organized until our ID came around. And it's really sad, but it inspires me to, as a Christian, try to improve my abilities the best that I can in order to try to bridge the gap between the deaf and the hearing communities. Morally, I care about the quality of my work that I provide because it hurts to know that so many deaf people, when they do have an interpreter, but aren't given adequate access due to a lack of ability, because there's such a range of interpreter skill and there's such a range of deaf people, and it's hard to find people every time that match the deaf person's mind perfectly. Some people may understand this thing and some people may understand this thing. There might not be enough background if an interpreter had background of this particular subject, maybe they would have done a better job, kind of a thing. Anyway, it's just very disappointing that there's a lack of access or sometimes no access at all. And so I want to do what I can to provide consumers with the belief that they aren't missing things in conversations or presentations. It's not their fault that they can't hear, so I think it's very sad that we punish them for that, albeit hopefully unintentionally. I'm not surprised that the deaf pride is such a strong thing because the culture of distrust has forced deaf people to have to combine forces in any way that they can, and this builds a wall against hearing interpreters. I've never realized another point that I thought was really important in the video was that I never realized the impact of the new generation of interpreters on the older generation of interpreters. I can't fully quite comment on this because I haven't experienced this conflict myself, but in the video there was this metaphor of these wolves, and they were in this den, and this was their den, and they did everything this way, and suddenly all these new wolves came in, and they were like, oh my gosh, like, why are you changing everything that we've been doing? And the point of this, I think, was to say there's not enough trust and communication and working together to try to further benefit the interpreting community. It's just kind of this us versus them kind of an idea, whereas I think they should be combining forces. Our profession is notoriously catty because everyone tends to put their worth in their skill set. And yes, it is a skill-based profession, but here at NCU we teach separating our work from our worth, and I think most places don't give depersonalized feedback. Most places don't teach to continue improving and not measure yourself by your skill. Another point that I thought was important was just his genuineness about being a coda and pretending that he is in this deaf world, but in reality he belongs to this hearing world. And again, I can just kind of relate to that a lot, because having only one deaf parent rather than two for me, I never was very immersed in the culture growing up, as I previously touched on. But I appreciated how genuine he was about it. And I just kind of wonder why. That's one of the questions that I have moving on to the next section here. I just kind of wonder why he wasn't as involved with the deaf community and deaf culture, since he did have two deaf parents. Another question that I have is, what's actually happening in the interpreting field between new and old interpreters? Like, what is this conflict, and how big of a deal actually is it? I definitely agree with Wing's point about the importance of us working together, but I don't see how bad this situation currently is to fully appreciate his message. Another question that I have is, how did Wing advance to these positions of power? Earlier in the video, he was talking about how he was offered a position, I think it was some sort of managerial position, I don't quite remember, but he had to turn it down because he belonged to the hearing world and couldn't well represent deaf people. And people assumed because he was a coda that he was a good fit for this. But he said that he turned it down because his father kind of explained to him, like, you kind of need to, this isn't right for you. And so later it says that people were gossiping about him and he was in this position of power. And so I just got a little confused as to how he got into a position of power, since he had previously turned it down. I don't know, that was just a little bit fuzzy of a point for me. And what were people saying about him, and why was it such a big deal? And how did that imbalance of power influence Wing's impact on the deaf community? So my overall evaluation of the message, I guess I've kind of touched on it already, but I can't say much about the conflict between the interpreters and the deaf people in the interpreting field. I can't say I understand fully how the new interpreters have taken over the wolf's den to use his metaphor. But the value of interpreters working together can't be understated. As Sydney has been saying, we're all colleagues working together to set the tone for future interpreters. Everything that we do, if we go into a job and we're unprofessional, the people in that situation are going to think that interpreters in the future will come in and be unprofessional and unreliable. And so I think we all need to humble ourselves and remember that we simply serve as the communication access for deaf people. If interpreters didn't work together with others in mind, the mold for what we should be doing will be broken all the time, and there will be no standards and no rules for what interpreters should look like. So that is my presentation on the Butler video. Thank you for watching.